I'm heavily indebted to this little book because you might read the book and you say, but that sounds like Johan's sermon, so that's why I just want to warn you beforehand. Set Apart, really a wonderful little book. I bought it about 25 years ago by Kent Hughes, and the title of the book, the subtitle is Calling a Worldly Church to a Godly Life. Calling a worldly church to a godly life. And it's really been a blessing to me, and it's one of those books, if I ever retire and I have to empty my office, I can't take everything along, because in the retirement home they just give you a shelf or two. I'll have to decide which books. This one is definitely going with me. So it's really a wonderful ideas that Kent put out in his book. So today we're going to look at pleasure. And remember, our series is, what is a Christian worldview? How do Christians view the world? And how do Christians view pleasure? Now, in the 20th century, there were two authors who wrote really groundbreaking books. The one was George Orwell, who wrote a book called 1984. And in this book, he described totalitarian regimes. Big Brother, you might have heard of the term Big Brother. It comes from George Orwell's book, 1984, where we live in a surveillance state, and we are watched every move that we make, and pain is inflicted on those who dare to step outside of, or out off the line, or outside of the prescribed parameters. And Orwell wrote in his book, and that was his prophecy almost, that society will be controlled by external oppression. We see it in China, we see it in many of the Islamic states where there's Sharia law, and all the big countries where oppression is rife. And then there was another man by the name of Aldous Huxley, and he wrote a very different book, but it's called Brave New World. And he spoke of an inner oppression of pleasure, where people would love the very things that oppress them, that people would be controlled by inflicting pleasure. And that sounds strange, but that is really what has happened in the West. People are drawn to pleasure, and the very pleasures that they pursue are the very things that are destroying them. You can just look at the social media, you look at YouTube or whatever apps you are on, and you can see what is going on in the West, especially in places like America, the UK, and other places. You can see the decadence. You can see people there that have just lost all resemblance of almost of humanity. And you think, if these folks ever have to face a war, I don't know who's going to do the fighting, because they really look strange and they act strange. You see cities full of people on drugs. In many of the inner cities in America, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of people that are addicted to meth and other drugs. So both these books were prophetic, as the one describes the kind of oppression of a totalitarian state in the East, and Huxley's book, A Brave New World, of what is happening in the West. Now, I'm not sure whether we are in the West. I think we're in the middle. I think we've got something of the East and something of the West, because we're in the middle. But we live in a society really that pursues pleasure. Calvin Miller, speaking of Western society, said the following. He said, "We believe that we can have as much as we want, of whatever we want, whenever we want it. No matter what life gives us, we always want more. We are the walking wanton." It's a wordplay there by Calvin Miller. The advertisers tell us, you deserve it. The world owes this to you, whether it's leisure, whether it's pleasure, whether it's meals, wine, clothing, labels, movie shows, holidays, entertainment, amusement, money. You need it. You must have it. And they tell you that you should do your utmost to get it. And so we are living in a generation of thrill seekers, looking for the next thrill that's around the corner. And maybe they are tired of the old thrill, so they try something new. And so we see the proliferation of many things that were unthinkable a few decades ago. We see something such as extreme sports. These are really people who are bored. They are bored with their lives, and so they do the next thing. They see how close they can get to death. And you see people doing crazy things, jumping off mountains with nothing but a wingsuit, like a bat flying over the mountains. And you think, why do these people do this? But the fact is that they are seeking that adrenaline rush. They're seeking pleasure, and they are bored, and so they will do. You'll see the increase of violence in sports. There are certain sports that are becoming more and more violent. You see in the movies and the shows, the more explicit and the more perverse the sexual content there is, the more popular those movies are, or the violence. And this is what we see. And Christians should be aware of these dangers, the dangers of hedonism. That's the word. It's a word that describes the pursuit of pleasure as the chief end of man. It's from the Greek word hedone, which means pleasure. So hedonism is seeking after pleasure. Now, in the Bible, there's one man that I think pursued pleasure like no one else and is synonymous with this kind of pursuit, and that is Solomon. And he actually describes it in his own words in this section that we've read today, in chapter 2, verse 1 to 11. The pursuit of pleasure. And he was very successful at it. I think he achieved more than any of us could ever hope to achieve in this life. He did it all. And he describes this, and I'm just going to briefly mention the things that he says. He says in verse 1, I thought in my heart, come now, that's my heart, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. And he says, but that also proved to be meaningless. And now he names the things that he was pursuing. Laughter. He said, I tried cheering myself with wine. Amusement. That's what he's talking about. He was pursuing amusement. He was the king. He could order the latest show, the latest troupe of singers, the greatest bands. He could invite them to his palace, and they would entertain him. Laughter, wine, comedy, choirs of singers, musical instruments is mentioned in verse 8. The next thing he did is he pursued grand projects and achievements, houses, vineyards, gardens, orchards, pools, groves of trees. I must say that sounds very exciting. It's something I would love to do if I had the money. That is really wonderful things to do. And so he pursued all these grand projects, and he built this all over Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. Then in verse 7, he mentions that he had male and female slaves and herds and flocks, thousands of workers that did everything that he wanted to do. When he says, I built houses and vineyards and gardens, it doesn't mean he physically did it. He just told them, you do this, you build that, you mix the daga, you lay the bricks, you plant the tree. And he had all these people who would do and meet every whim of his. And then wealth and riches, gold and silver in verse 8, works of art, royal treasure, not only from Israel, but from the surrounding lands. He had a harem, sex. That's what a harem is all about. He had, I don't know how many women living in this harem. In verse 8, fame. He had greater fame than anyone before him, in verse 9. So Solomon had it all. And he says in verse 10, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. He achieved it all. Nothing stood in the way of his pleasure. Everything was accessible to him. He could follow his every whim. But you know what he says in the end? He says, all of this brought me very short-lived meaning and pleasure, and it turned out to be meaningless apart from God. Notice in verse 1 he says, all of these pleasures proved to me meaningless. And in verse 11, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. My friends, take it as a Christian today, listening to a wise man like Solomon, who had it all. If all the things he had and all the things he pursued and achieved, if that did not bring him meaning and ultimate fulfillment, it won't do it for you, because you will not even get close to what he had done and what he had achieved. But we can have pleasure as well. We may not be able to do all these things, but they are God-given pleasures. God made this world, we are told in the Bible, over and over again for man to enjoy. In the beginning, we read, God made everything as he made it. He called it good. And eventually, when he completed everything he had made, he called it very good. And we read in 1 Timothy 4 verse 4, for everything God created is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it's received with thanksgiving. Just to give you an idea on how the book of Ecclesiastes works, there's this play between the worldling and the person who fears God. So whenever the worldling thinks about things, whatever they are, he ends with the words, under the sun or meaningless. That's what Solomon says. But then there's another part in Ecclesiastes where all of these things are considered in the light of God's provision and God's existence. And then he speaks as a believer. Then there's a different tone. Then everything is full of meaning and full of purpose. So in the second part, we see that God made this world for men and women to enjoy. In chapter 2, verse 24 and 25, which I've read, it says, accept everything as a good gift from God's hand. A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. So Solomon is not schizophrenic. He's not like, he hasn't got a double, what do you call people with two personalities? Whatever. But I'm not good at psychology, but there are these people, they've got like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's not like he's an unbeliever now and then he's a believer here. He's just saying the way that you look at things, the way you do things, do you see it as a worldling or do you see it as from the hand of God? And he says, for without him, in verse 25, who can eat or find enjoyment? Now, a certain commentator by the name of Leland Ryken, he noted 6 God-given categories of pleasures that are available. Now, there may be others, but I'm just going with what he said. And he said these things are all around us, for all of us. And the one that he mentions, the first one he mentions is nature. The beauty of the stars, the sound and the smell of rain, the mountains, the waterfalls, flowers in a field. You see, when people go and visit places, they normally go to where there's great scenes of natural beauty. And he says this is given to us by God. Human artistry, poets and literature and music and singing and paintings and all these things, he says that is given by God. Human artistry is a gift that God has given man for others to enjoy. And whether the artwork is worth $10 million, you're still able to see it and enjoy it. Family is the next one he mentions. He says family, the blessing of family. He's put us in families. And maybe our families are a bit disjointed and maybe there's some strife in the family, but at the end of the day, he's given us brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers and children and grandchildren. And that's a great blessing. He's given us social life and community. We're all part of a community. Some of us have been disrupted, taken out of our community, like some of our folks here have been taken from their countries in Africa. But for the most, we have communities, and when we go to a new place, we form new communities in social life. The next area, the fifth area he mentions, is romantic love and sexual fulfillment. That's a gift from God that He's given us. Just read the Song of Songs and you will read all about it. And then the last category he mentions is corporate worship. When you worship with other believers, Christians together. You know what the interesting thing about all these 6 are? And like I said, there may be others which I've missed or he has missed. You know what is interesting about these? One common thread through all of them. It's all free. You don't need any money. None of it. For none of them you need any money. You can enjoy them whether you're rich or poor. These pleasures are for everyone. You don't need to work hard or earn money. You don't need wealth or status. And you don't have to pursue them. They are right in front of you. He quotes, Ken Hughes quotes a poor Methodist woman from the 18th century, and she says the following: I do not know when I had happier times in my soul than when I've been sitting at my work with nothing before me but with a candle and a white cloth, and hearing no sound but that of my own breath, with God in my soul and heaven in my eye. I rejoice being exactly what I am, a creature capable of loving God, and who, as long as God lives, must be happy. I get up and I look a while out the window. I gaze at the moon and the stars, the work of an almighty hand, and I think of the grandeur of the universe. And then I sit down and I think of myself as one of the happiest beings in it. That is a Christian perspective on pleasure, which we so often miss. There are pleasures everywhere, my brothers and sisters. For the Christian, there is nothing that is withheld, that is good, that comes from God's hand. Think of the happiest times in your life when you were together with family, when a little child, maybe a grandchild, put his hand or her hand in yours or gave you a hug. When you saw your loved one looking at you in that special way. When you took a walk in the mountains, or you saw the night sky, or were in the high veld and you heard a thunderstorm and saw the lightning. Remember when we lived on the high veld, and there was an electric storm, I would open the curtain, switch off the lights, and put the couch right against the sliding doors and just sit there and look at this spectacle, which you don't see here in Cape Town, unfortunately. It was amazing to watch that and to think that God has made this, to see the beauty of a waterfall like the Zambezi waterfalls or the Victoria Falls or whatever they're called, Mosia Tunja. These are all things, my friends, a flower in your garden, all things, a family gathering, a meal with friends. These are beautiful things, beautiful in their time. Sitting in a church service and you're feeling despondent, and you hear the Christians, whether they are full of faults and full of mistakes, but they're all singing together for the glory of God, and you hear the beauty of the hymn, and you forget about those around you, and it's just you and God singing corporately with all the other believers to the Lord. And these things are all free. The third thing we need to mention this morning is that we so often pervert pleasure. That's why this little book is called Calling a Worldly Church to a Godly Life. So often we pervert pleasure. How do we do it? Now, I don't like parodies about spiritual things, about devils and demons and angels, but C.S. Lewis, he wrote a little book called The Screwtape Letters. And yeah, I don't know what to make of it, but I want to read a part of this to you, because Screwtape, you know who Screwtape was? He was a senior devil. So this is a letter. Letters written by a senior devil to a junior devil who is called Wormwood. And the enemy is God. All right, so this is what he writes. He writes to his cousin or his understudy Wormwood. Never forget that when we are dealing with any pleasure in its healthy and normal and satisfying form, we are in a sense on the enemy's ground. Who's the enemy? God's ground. He's the enemy. I know we have won many a soul through pleasure. All the same, it is his invention, not ours. He made all the pleasures. All our research so far has not enabled us to produce one. These are now the devils talking. All we can do is to encourage humans to take the pleasures which our enemy has produced at times or in ways or in degrees which he has forbidden. Hence, we always try to work away from the natural condition of any pleasure to that which is least natural, least representative of its maker, and least pleasurable. An ever-increasing craving for and ever-diminishing pleasure is the formula. Because you see, when you pervert the pleasure, it doesn't give you what God has intended you to give. So what do you need? You need more. You need ever more perverted forms of this pleasure to give you the same craving. It's like drugs. Your receptors in your brain are damaged. So every time you take another dose, you need more to get the same effect. And that's what we do with God's pleasures. Later, Screwtape declares, He has filled, that's now the enemy, God. He has filled His world full of pleasures. There are things for humans to do all day long without Him minding in the least. Sleeping, washing, eating, drinking, making love, praying, playing, working. Everything has to be twisted before it's of any use to us. That's the insight from the mind of a devil, as Lewis saw it. So pleasure is perverted when we forget that pleasure is a good gift from God. The second way we see that it's perverted is when it becomes a pursuit. When you pursue the pleasure for the pleasure itself and not for who you got it from whose hand you received it. When we pursue pleasure for pleasure's sake, we imagine that this pleasure is something that I can have apart from God. I don't see it's from the hand of God. I can have this without God in the picture. Whether it's money, food, sex, whatever it is. Full pleasure can never be apart from the ultimate source of pleasure, whether it's creation, art, family, love, food, community, worship, money. And the more you run after pleasure for pleasure's sake, the less you will find it. The less you will find it. Even the trials, the heartaches, the handicaps that others seek to avoid are touched with the blessing of heaven and seem to minister to the heart of the one who has learned to take them from the hand of God. There's a Puritan, John Welsh, who was on his deathbed. He was lying on his deathbed and he was beset with illness. And God's presence was so real to him that he said the following, that people said this about him: the sensible enjoyment of God blurring his last illness. During this time, he was heard to pray, Lord, hold thine hand. It is enough. Thy servant is but a clay vessel and can hold no more. While he was lying on his deathbed, God was pouring his pleasure and his delight in John Welsh's soul. And while he lay dying, he said, Lord, you're giving me so much, I can't handle it. If you pour more in, I will just burst open. I can't take it. He was so enthralled with God and with his pleasure. Another way when we pervert pleasure is if we consider it our right. We live in a time when we hear about human rights. When we grab at something which is a gift of God, then it becomes sin. We forget that this pleasure is a gift of God. And instead of accepting it with gratitude from the hand of God, we grab it. When pleasure is overindulged, whether it's nature or eating or whatever else, a banquet's good. But every meal cannot be a banquet. You can't make a banquet of every meal. Enjoying a sports match is good, but you can't watch sport every week. Sorry, you can't. You know what? It's going to become dull, and you'll just flick through the channels, and it makes no difference because you're seeing it all the time. And there are people who spend hours and hours and hours every week watching the latest cricket or tennis or rugby match. It's not going to give you enjoyment because it's meaningless. Not to say that once in a while, if you go to a sports match, it's not good. A Caribbean cruise or European holiday or whatever is good. If somebody wants to pay for that, good, go. But if you do it perpetually, it will mean nothing. Sex is good. It's from God. It doesn't come from Hollywood. It comes from God. But only between one husband and one wife. And so we can go on. If we pursue pleasure for pleasure's sake, it will become our God. The source of all pleasure. Let's end with the source of all pleasure. I like the Westminster Confession that says, you know, what is the chief purpose of man? The chief purpose of man is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. When I was a kid, I thought you can glorify God. It means you keep all the rules, but it's a pretty miserable business. Or you can enjoy God and you're sinning all the time. I never thought you can actually combine the two. Glorify God and enjoy God. But that's how it is. We can glorify God and enjoy God. And I think the man who wrote the most about this idea is probably John Piper. If you ever read his books, Desiring God. He's actually got a book, Desiring God, The Confessions of a Christian Hedonist. That's his book, one of his books. And then the other one I know or I have is The Pleasures of God, Meditation on God's Delight in Being God. So there are these books. And you know, my friends, where is the source of eternal pleasures? Psalm 16 verse 11 tells us. It says, you, that is God, has made known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence and with eternal pleasures at your right hand. He's the source of eternal pleasure. Solomon's mistake was God gave him all these things. But in his old age, he moved away from God. And he turned away from the words of God and the fear of God. And it says in 1 Kings 11 verse 9, and the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel. You have to pursue and desire God. If He is the source of pleasure, then there's no point in pursuing the pleasure. You have to pursue God. In verse 11 of chapter 3, it says, God has made everything beautiful in its time. He set eternity in the hearts of men. I know that there is nothing better for men to be happy and to do good while they live, that everyone may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all his toil. This is the gift of God, and I know that everything God does will endure forever. I want to conclude with this last verse, which is one of the greatest verses to me in the Bible. It's God's pleasure is an increasing, ever-increasing feedback loop of joy. In Psalm 37 verse 4 it says, delight yourself in Yahweh, and He will give you the desires of your heart. You know why I say that it's a feedback loop of joy? Because the more I delight myself in God, the more my desires and my delights are in God. And God gives me more of Himself. And then I want more of Him. And He gives me more of Himself. And so it just grows and grows. And you're in this spiral of joy. Getting more from God. And as you get more from God, you want more from God. And so it goes on and on. And my friends, that should be our pursuit. Delight yourself in the Lord, in Yahweh, and He will give you all the desires of your heart, which will not be the things of the world, but will be the things of God. Amen.